Welcome all. I'm so delighted to greet you. Forgive me for some of my technical hitches there. My name is Anne Single, and it's my pleasure as CEO of Patient Voice Initiative to welcome you to this webinar. I join you from Brisbane, Australia, which is the lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal, and so I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also want to pay my respects to any First Nations people online today. Patient Voice Initiative is being so excited about having this webinar, so I hope you are too. We're a patient organisation committed to patients being seen, heard and valued in health technology assessment. And we do this with a strengths-based approach to equipping patient communities with the know-how and the know-who, and advocating for systems that are better able to learn from patient knowledge and be shaped by them. In this webinar, we want to raise awareness of a key new publication and just take an hour to reflect on a couple of really important aspects in it. With me today, I have four of the 121 authors of the book. A face that will be familiar to many of you is Alicia Segrave. She's the Director of Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit in the Office of HTA at the Australian Government's Department of Health, Disability and Ageing. She's worked in HTA for more than 20 years, and she's supported the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee and the Medical Services Advisory Committee in her current role. She leads the team that facilitates consumer engagement in HTA. Her background's as a pharmacist, and she has a PhD in biopharmaceutics. Hi, Alicia.
Hi,
I
Anne.
probably
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Great to have you here. Next, we'll hear from Pascal Leroux. Aside from writing two books on HTA that really resonated and stimulated my thinking, Pascal is Scientific Vice President in the HTA body in Quebec called ANESH, and she's a full professor with the Department of Health Management, Evaluation and Policy at the University de Montreal. She held the Canada Research Chair in Health Innovations for a decade, and her 7-year research program on responsible innovation in health was funded through the highly competitive foundation scheme of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Her influential work has seen her receive several awards, including the 30th Anniversary Medal of CADTH in 2019, and that's the Canadian HTA body now known as CDA. Good evening, Pascal.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, Pascal. We also have Roma Dhamanaskar, sorry, Roma, who recently received a PhD in health policy from McMaster University and has a Master's of Bioethics from the University of Pennsylvania. Roma's research interests are at the intersection of bioethics theory and public and patient engagement practice, and her dissertation explored the use of justice theories to advance ethical and fair engagement in public and patient engagement in health system organisations. And she's going to say a lot more about that today. Roma is currently working as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Roma.
Hi, Anne. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be here.
Great to have you. And finally, a face that may also be familiar to some of you is Barry Stein. Barry is a survivor of metastatic colorectal cancer. He was diagnosed in 1995, and he was obliged to seek healthcare outside of Canada to fight his disease. His judgment, which was obtained in the Superior Court of Quebec in 1999, still serves as a leading precedent in Canada for the reimbursement of out-of-country healthcare. His lengthy experience in patient organisations and advocacy includes being a founding member of the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer National Colorectal Cancer Screening Network. He's the president and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Canada, and he sits on many advisory boards and panels, including the Patient Preferences Group in the Patient and Citizens Interest Group in HTAI. He's received several awards for his work, including the 2021 CCRA Award for Exceptional Leadership in Patient Involvement in Cancer Research. Good evening and welcome, Barry. I hope you're less tongue-twisted than I am today.
Good evening and good morning to all of you down under. Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Anne.
Great to have you, Barry. So over this hour, I have a few questions for our panelists, And I would love you to add your questions to the chat. And first, I want to give you a little bit of information about the book, which I had the privilege to work on with the lead editor, Karen Facey, and my other co-editor, Anki Peggy Holthoff. So the book has 33 chapters, and as I mentioned, 121 authors, and 3 out of the 4 chapters have patient authors. And it's the second edition of the only book on this topic, and the first to be fully open access. And it aims to challenge those who work without patient involvement to reconsider the quality and conclusiveness of their work, and to inform and inspire those of you studying, working, or volunteering in this field to keep questioning, keep reflecting, keep caring, and keep going. And so I'm thrilled to see the hard work pay off. And already in just under 100 days, the site has had 179,000 accesses. So we want it to make a difference, and that's a great start. Before I speak to our panel, I just want to lock in a few concepts which are central to the book. The first is how we define patient involvement. So we define it as both research into patient aspects and also patient participation. So research into patient aspects is that robust quantitative or qualitative research and analysis from a range of disciplines to establish knowledge about the impacts of a health technology on patients, carers, and their families. And we'll be talking a lot more about that today, as well as patient participation, what we might call in Australia consumer engagement. And that's a range of activities which enable patient carers and groups that support and advocate for them to contribute their knowledge regarding their needs, preferences, experiences, and perspectives before, during, or after HTAs, and also to influence the methods, processes, and governance and policy around HTA. And the other concept that you may be familiar with from previous webinars is around patient knowledge, as described by Denez and Lesperance. So we're really leading into those Canadians today. And they describe patient knowledge as knowledge gained from learning through the self, the system, and your health condition community. And that can be classified into 6 types: the embodied, the monitoring, the navigational, the medical, the relational, and cultural knowledge. And they provide a framework to recognise patients as valuable knowledge partners in healthcare, not just recipients of care or interest holders. And we think in Patient Voice Initiative, patients as knowledge holders is a key concept. And that's why we wear our badges. Mine's over here today, saying we value patient knowledge. So that's enough of me. I want to hear from our authors. And so can I start, Alicia, with hearing from you? Because you were one of the authors that wrote the chapter on what's happening in Australia. This is the second time that the chapter, we've had a chapter on Australia. And I'm really keen to know what's the main focus of it.
Thanks, Anne. The chapter, I guess, tells the story of how consumer involvement has evolved over time in Australia, particularly since 2017, including the establishment of, as you've mentioned, the Consumer Evidence and Engagement Unit that sits in the department and supports and strengthens consumer participation. The chapter also lays out patient participation opportunities in the HTA processes for 2 of our main advisory committees, so those being the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee that makes recommendations about medicines and vaccines, and the Medical Services Advisory Committee that provides advice on medical services, diagnostics, devices, health programs, and highly specialised therapies. And these include the opportunities for consumer input for each health technology application. And one of the examples in there is the early and targeted input for the Medical Services Advisory Committee, or the PICO, Population Intervention Comparator Outcome Development. So that's the foundations of the assessment in terms of defining the patients the health interventions for, what the current treatment options are for comparison, and what both clinical and patient reported outcomes are relevant to consider. Then what the chapter does is it spotlights 3 areas of patient participation in HTA. And firstly, really, we talk about a feature of consumer engagement in the Australian system being about that we consider input both from individuals and from organisations, which we found provides additional depth and understanding and more diversity in the range of experiences that we hear. The other spotlight that we do is about the HTA Consumer Consultative Committee, which is a committee that brings together the consumer members from each of our HTA committees in Australia and their subcommittees, and it advises the department, but also, Australia more broadly, on consumer perspectives in HTA and how we can improve our communications and our collaborations and participation opportunities. And the third spotlight, really, I think, to answer your question, Anne, from my perspective, the main focus of the chapter this time is the deliberate shift towards co-design and partnership and capability building rather than ad hoc style consultation. And I think this is illustrated in this third area that we spotlight by a project that we did in Australia, which was co-designing an enhanced consumer engagement process. And this piece of work was consumer-led, and it was collaborative, and it, between consumers and government industry. And I think both the construct of that working group and the report of its recommendations really signalled both an emphasis on collaboration and co-design, but a genuine shift to better embedding consumer perspectives in HTA decision making. So I think in that sense, what the chapter reflects is a maturing of our system beyond, far beyond just asking whether consumers should be involved, but really making sure that that's meaningful and consistent and purposeful.
Oh, yeah, there's a huge amount, and there's been a huge amount of activity in your unit and in Australia in this area. And dare I say it, even since this book went to bed, what's the most important thing in your mind that's happened since this went to publication? I guess we finalised the chapters in August and it went to print in December and was published in January.
I mean, there's a few things, but from my point of view, the most significant change and something that's quite live at the moment for us is the development of Australia's framework for consumer engagement in HTA. So this is a framework that draws from and builds on several pieces of work that have been co-developed with stakeholders over the past few years. And this includes the co-designed enhanced consumer engagement process that I just referred to earlier, also a departmental-led consultation known as Conversations for Change, and Australia's HTA policy and methods review, of which, Anne, I know you're on the reference group for that, and it's near and dear. And I think across these pieces of work, there was a really consistent message that consumer engagement in HTA needs to be much more visible, clear, early, consistent, more meaningful. And so the framework that we've developed responds to that by setting out a shared approach. And we've designed a framework to try and make it accessible and quite concise and practical and durable. So we're trying to achieve a lot of things, in what's quite a concise piece of work. The other thing I think with the framework is, consumer engagement isn't new. It evolves and grows and continues to. And so with the framework that we've developed, what we've tried to focus on is it's supporting and optimising what we currently do, and also leaving room and promoting a growth and evolution of getting patient perspectives into HTA. What else? So I guess a couple of the other things about the framework that may be different to some international approaches is that we've made a framework that's applicable to our whole HTA system in Australia, so that it can be applied consistently by everyone, whatever their role is, irrespective of the type of technology or the funding program, because we do have multiple funding programs in Australia, or the HTA advisory committee that might be making a decision on funding. And, it's a principles-based framework. So it has guiding principles, but what it really does then is identify focus areas, and then on from that, actions that we can all take to try and put those focus areas into practice. So I think this is the big shift, because I think it's taking us from kind of single activity approach and what we were doing, which was really building momentum over the last few years, into actually getting to the point now of, that embedding it and being able to see ourselves in it.
Oh, it's great. And I've just stuck the link in there in the chat
Thank you.
so that people know we've got to the 26th of May to comment on it. It's only 3 pages and really worth a look because I think it's a real milestone for the developments. I know we've got to hurry along, but I wanted to ask you one more thing, which was you often talk, and it's there in the draft framework, you often talk about consumer engagement being everyone's role in HTA. Can you just tell us briefly, what does that look like to you?
So I think it's a range of things. So in the consumer evidence and engagement unit, I see ourselves in the department as kind of a system enabling role and a supporting role. So we don't own engagement, but we try and help other people to do it. We try to bring it together and facilitate it. And a lot of what we try to do is develop and work with the stakeholders to do shared guidance and tools and resources so that we have that central focus point and to build the capability and sort of support good practice and to listen, right? And to be accessible, to be able to listen and have conversations often. But what I hope is that other stakeholders see themselves, see what their role is in it. So, for example, HTA committees themselves, being clear about what input they're seeking, how they've taken that into account and being transparent with, sharing that information in their decisions. For our secretariats and our policy areas in the department, it's actually designing those processes that think about consumer engagement right from the beginning, not as an afterthought. I think with, for example, industry, I suspect that we actually don't hear a lot about early engagement that's happened, during clinical trial designs and things like that, some of which I think is probably relevant. And so I think because the PBAC guidelines, for example, might not ask what consumer engagement has happened since product development, we don't hear about it, but actually building that continuum and sharing that message, I think is really important as well. So they're just a couple of the examples, but I hope there's a lot in it.
Yeah, and I think we might even come back to that, and it's there. I can see how it resonates with the book as well. But thank you. I'm going to jump now to Pascal. Welcome again, Pascal. We've been talking about the participation part of patient involvement, particularly there with Alicia, but the book highlights that while participation is growing around the world, we're really not progressing far on research into patient aspects. You've got an immense amount of experience here. Why is it difficult to include qualitative research in HTA despite its robustness?
Well, I will start by stressing that I could be wrong, Anne. but I do believe that few efforts have been made to consolidate qualitative methods within HTA in general, but also a few efforts to build the skill set needed to analyze patient-related evidence much more specifically. And I see two possibilities regarding why this might have happened. So the first, I believe, is a certain lack of recognition of the misfit, the current misfit between the HTA skill set that has been valued and formalized so far, which is focused on quantitative evidence. And this misfit has been reinforced by, I guess, the false assumption that any type of scientist can handle qualitative research, while in fact we know that specific knowledge, know-how, and skills are needed. The second possibility revolves around a certain misconception regarding what Alicia just mentioned, regarding when the patient voice should be integrated. So I believe that some may think that this should happen only later at the deliberation stage, when all the evidence has been gathered, synthesized, analyzed. So of course, having patient in deliberation is really, really important, but gathering their perspective and experiences from the beginning. So for us, it would mean at the evaluation question framing stage and throughout the evidence synthesis, gathering, synthesis, and analysis process is even more important because it's more transformative. And to do this, it requires a strong command of what rigorous qualitative research entails in practice. That would be my sort of explanation why.
Yeah, and I like that you say we could be wrong, but I could be wrong too. But I often think maybe we're underestimating the field and just haven't got that knowledge. And you say something really interesting in your discussion chapter in the book. You say that we need to think qualitatively. We're doing plenty of quantitative. We want to think qualitatively in HTA. What do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm. Qualitative research is good in addressing why and how questions, which are key to understanding human actions. And these why and how questions have a particular resonance in HTA when we recognize that health technologies are applied by people to other people. So by people, we may have doctors, nurses, technicians, relatives, patients themselves. So I think that what I try to stress in the chapter is that thinking qualitatively means bringing to the fore the meaning, the purpose of a health intervention and how it changes the everyday life of those involved in the process. And if I may, I would like us to do a brief thought experiment. And it might be weird at first, but try to trust me. So if I would ask you, what would you do if you wanted to get to know a cat, one that you've never seen before? So how would you learn about its preferences, experience, and everyday life? And I guess that most of us would approach it carefully, stay somewhat quiet, observe its behavior, responses to different things, but also to different living beings in its surrounding. And if the cat shies away, hisses, arches its back, or never comes back to you, when you then ask yourself or reflect about your own interactions with this cat. So here, what I want to stress is that certainly I'm not saying that patients are like cats, but I'm trying to bring to your attention with the thought experiment is the human skills that are required to get to know another living being, especially when these living beings don't share a common language, abilities, challenges, and life form. So, thinking qualitatively requires human skills that differ from those we usually learn in quantitative research. Um, and such skills include being reflexive about the meanings, process, context, and also adopting a social scientific lens. So, I've said a lot of things so far, but in practical terms, I guess on the one hand, it means paying attention to what patients may say or may not say in an interview or focus group. So focusing on their words and silences. On the other hand, it also means paying attention or at least aiming to grasp what they do or do not do when a technology enters their life and also the life of those with whom they interact. So we need to focus on their actions or what we would call agency and sometimes lack of agency. So I believe that digging into those two questions, why and how, a health intervention is valuable for patients. This is not something that is optional. It's not simply an add-on to asking whether it's effective, safe, or a good use of our collective resources. So this is why I think it matters to think qualitatively.
I love your example. It slows my mind down, even saying it, if that's the expression I can use, because I think about how we currently try to learn from patients, and we do it through, templated surveys and questions, and we see in Patient Voice Initiative often questions that just have quite simple language can be interpreted in so many ways, and they extract some answers, but they don't do anything of what you were just speaking about. And so what are we missing? What are we missing by not in thinking qualitatively? What are we missing by not including qualitative work in our HTAs?
If I may, I will start on by saying, just to be clear, that I do believe that quantitative measures of patients' preferences and experiences are really helpful and important because of the larger scale on which such studies can be conducted. So that being said, I think it's equally important to consolidate qualitative methods because in certain situations, they do have a clear competitive advantage. And I'm thinking about topics, HTA topics, where these advantages do matter a lot. I'm thinking about topics that raise sensitive issues or require meaningful exchange with hard-to-reach groups. I'm also thinking about topics where outcomes for patients may vary across settings, over time, or also across sociocultural groups. And there's also the broader societal role that HTA seeks to play in publicly funded healthcare systems. So I believe that thinking qualitatively in HTA can help the field as a whole to stay true to the rich, but also complex and at times conflicting views and realities of patients. And I think this is something that we cannot afford to miss.
That's a really useful point too, about it's not about disposing of other ways of knowing, and it's about bringing that more complete way of knowing, and maybe in specific circumstances. Thank you, Pascal. I know we're going to have more questions, and please, everyone, feel free to drop them in the box. Now I want to go over to Roma. Welcome, Roma. It's so nice to have you on the call. Your chapter, chapter 2 in the book, sets up justice as an ethical rationale for patient involvement in HTA, and you frame it quite differently to how we often hear it or talk about it. And I wondered if you could tell us, please, a bit about the 3 types of justices that you discuss in the chapter.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I'll start with a couple disclaimers. First of all, I may use the word engagement instead of involvement. We tend to use engagement in the Canadian context, and after writing the word engagement like 17,000 times in my dissertation, it's like a reflex
You are
now.
absolutely welcome. We will know what you mean.
Awesome, thank you. And then second of all, I'll say I do kind of come into this space from an academic lens. So I wouldn't say that I'm an expert in HTA processes, nor do I have that all-important lived patient knowledge. So I'm glad to be speaking alongside others who bring that expertise. I mean, I'd like to frame the conversation first by just saying that the point of the chapter is really to make justice something that is approachable and something that we can actually try to strive towards in this work. I know the word justice can seem quite abstract and weighty, like what does it even mean? But I think, justice is only possible if we think that it's within our grasp. And I do believe it is the ethical rationale behind this work. So I discuss 3 theories of justice in the chapter: procedural justice, social justice, and epistemic injustice. So I'll try to go through each and describe each at a high level. So procedural justice is really concerned with the fairness of processes and practices, and how we judge fairness depends on how well a practice aligns with some underlying principle like transparency or accountability. So as an ethical rationale, we involve patients in HTA because we think it makes the process more fair and more just. So we might say that patient involvement improves the accountability of HTA processes by involving those who are the most impacted by these decisions. Social justice is concerned with how processes and practices meet the needs of equity deserving groups, and that recognizes that certain groups are systematically disadvantaged and therefore experience poorer health. And from a social justice perspective, I hope we would all think that patient involvement is justified because it has the potential to really improve health equity, especially if we are able to meaningfully involve those communities that are equity deserving. And I think social justice also brings a bit of a critical lens, asking, why do certain technologies get championed? Who benefits from this? And how do HTA decisions at the end of the day contend with health disparities or try to promote health equity? And then finally, epistemic injustice. It's kind of a big one, but I'll try to describe it at a high level. It's concerned with who is seen as a credible knower, and also who has the conceptual tools to participate in knowledge sharing practices. So by adopting an epistemic injustice lens, we would ask whether knowledge sharing practices are fair in HTA when we involve patients, and also whether all the relevant knowers are present and able to contribute. So I think this is a really strong rationale for patient involvement, because it's essentially saying what I think patients have said for a long time, which is that we are relevant knowers and we do have valuable knowledge, and therefore we deserve a seat at the table. So that's my high level overview.
Thank you. I'm so conscious of how much we're condensing your PhD down to a few minutes, but it's super interesting, and that's why we're delighted to have you. I wonder, can you tell us a little bit more about epistemic justice? Because in Patient Voice Initiative, we think it's really important that patients are seen as knowledge holders. And I think this idea of epistemic justice then becomes really important. What does it mean for recognizing and using patient knowledge in HTA, hearing your caveat that HTA is not your area of specialty?
Absolutely. So yeah, this is a bit of a dense theory, so bear with me, and if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. So epistemic injustice, as I mentioned, it's concerned with fairness and knowledge sharing. And so someone could be said to experience epistemic injustice if they're being treated unfairly in their capacity as a knowledge holder. So Miranda Fricker, who kind of articulated this very nicely, she kind of broke this down into two different forms of injustice. The first is testimonial injustice, and this occurs when someone experiences what we can call like a credibility deficit. So that person is not seen as a credible haver of knowledge because of some facet of their identity, whether that be their identity as a patient, as a member with a disability, as a member of a particular race, gender. So in the context of HTA and of patient involvement, I think we can think about if and how patients can experience epistemic injustice in spaces where patient knowledge and lived experiences are still not afforded the same level of credibility as technical knowledge that we tend to understand better, like clinical research, economic analysis. And I think this is something that's like super entrenched and hard to undo within health systems, where there is this hierarchy of evidence with like systematic reviews at the top and qualitative research below that. So, I mean, I'd be interested, Pascal, in your perspective, if you think that might be another reason why qualitative research might not have as much legitimacy in this space. And then the experiences of patients isn't really, traditionally on that list. So overall, patients can experience testimonial injustice when their knowledge is undervalued, even if they are present, even if they are there within HTA processes. And then the second type of injustice is called hermeneutical injustice. This happens when someone experiences an intelligibility deficit. So they do not have the conceptual resources, essentially the language, to make others or even themselves understand their experience. So this can happen in the context of HTA if we involve patients, but we don't actually adapt our processes and language to receive patient knowledge. So language that's used by researchers, things about like generalizability, strength of the evidence, p-values, that language doesn't really resonate when we're talking about the subjective, personal, lived reality of a patient. And a patient's experience might not be easily summarized in a report or a form or a survey. So when we involve patients in ways that don't actually challenge the norms of how we create and share knowledge in HTA, this can inadvertently lead to hermeneutical injustice. So overall, I would say this theory is powerful. It asks us to question how we come to know things and also who has the power to contribute to knowledge. And I do think HTA has come a long way. I think for a long time, patients weren't contributing at all in this space, but now we seem to agree, and I would believe everyone on this call would agree, that involving patients is important because patients are credible knowers. But it's important to remain thoughtful and attentive to how our processes are working, because they could still impart epistemic injustice if we're not careful.
Oh, thank you, Roma. I think that bit about hermeneutical, I knew I shouldn't try and say it, hermeneutical injustice is really interesting to me about often about whether people understand the language of patients. We spend sometimes wondering whether they understand the language of HTA, but particularly with AI tools increasing, I worry that we may not really understand the language of patients. But before I ask you one more question, I just wondered whether Pascal wanted to respond to the question you gave her.
I would just say I agree with you, Roma. Because there is this kind of hierarchy, implicit or explicit hierarchy among methods, but also objects of inquiry. What we look at, it's also something that suffers from epistemic injustice. Thank you so much. Thanks,
Thank
Pascal.
you. And I just had, well, I know we'll have more questions, but I wondered whether there are key questions that the community can think about asking to ensure HTA is just. Do you have any insights there?
Yeah, I came up with a few, though I think the number of questions is like ever growing. And if you use these theories as like your basis, you could, come up with many, many questions. I do think this is important because I do think it can be hard to identify injustice unless you're being reflective and thinking critically. So, as an overarching statement, maybe it's important to evaluate processes so you know what's working and what isn't, and if injustice is present and how you can go towards correcting it. In terms of procedural justice, we can think about, why do we follow this practice? Where does this practice come from? Is it just something that's like inherited within the organization, or does it actually align with some underlying principle? What are the principles that by which we should judge our processes? And how does this practice actually help us meet that principle, whether that's transparency or trustworthiness or accountability? Social justice, I think the big question of social justice is just who benefits from this process, who benefits from this decision, who is being involved and who's being left out, and how are we engaging communities who are often underrepresented, and are we doing so in ways that are community informed and safe? And then finally, for epistemic injustice, some questions that come to mind are who's a credible knower in this space? Are we taking efforts to involve all the credible knowers? If not, who benefits and who's left out? How are processes set up to recognize the value of patient knowledge? And how are they set up to actually adopt and receive that knowledge and take it up into decision making? Yeah.
Oh, I find that super useful. I think particularly as we think about our processes and where we need to go, those are great questions for us to come back to. Barry, I'm so pleased to have you here with us tonight. You've been sitting listening, but I've got loads of questions for you too. But you're welcome to reflect on some of what you heard. But I did want to start by asking you, you know, um, some in our audience have a bit of experience or knowledge of patient preference studies. We've had some great webinars on it, but I would love if you could explain it to those in our patient communities who may not be familiar with what patient preference studies were. I know you were an author on that chapter.
Right. It's a really great question. And first of all, I apologize for my voice. It's allergy season has just begun in Montreal and it's hitting hard. I think we should start with the why. And I think that this is extremely relevant for patient groups. And I'll try to take a very practical approach to the work that we've done. So first of all, why do any type of input whatsoever? And it really goes back to reducing the uncertainty that is adduced as evidence to both our regulatory and our health technology assessment agencies, at least in Canada. And how do we reduce that uncertainty? One of it, from the patient group or patient perspective, is to provide what they ask for in the templates, both at Canada's Drug Agency and at INES, a lot about patient experience data. So I think a lot of patient groups know what patient experience data is, the patient anecdotes, the qualitative research that they do, and in some cases, even quantitative research through surveys, as we do here at Colorectal Cancer Canada. So Understanding the why you're doing it is because you want to reduce the uncertainty and provide and inform those people at the who are making the decisions, the deliberative committee, the expert committee, to have more of the patient perspective before them. So I really want to underscore what Pascal said before, and that is that, you know, why just start at the deliberative stage? Why ask, in the 30 days before a decision or recommendation is going to be, considered, ask for that input? And I would argue that it's extremely important to involve, and this goes back to what Roma said, not necessarily just engage, but involve the patient and the patient group as far back as the clinical ideation of a clinical trial goes, the development of the protocol, recruitment, and work with those patients throughout the clinical trial so that patients and patient groups are better informed when they go back in to provide that type of input. It's really tough to get that type of input in 30 days or so. So a long time ago, when I was trying to figure out how could we have more weight, WEIGHT, in the decision-making process so that the patient perspectives would be, held equally with some of the other input that's done. So at that time, I was pretty naive. I didn't know what patient preferences was. I was just learning about patient experience data. And there was a health economist actually working at INES and in Quebec. And I asked him, his name is Rainer Beike, what can we do to give greater weight to our work? He said, well, you have to do it in a research-oriented fashion. So we went back and we tried to figure out what that meant. And ultimately, after about a year, I worked with Deb McDonald, University of Calgary, and her team to try to develop a patient preference study, not really fully even understanding the difference between patient experience data and patient preference data. So in the chapter, actually, we talk about how patient preference research captures preferences, trade-offs, value beyond the clinical outcomes, and generating insights from those patient perspectives. And it's important from a patient group perspective to understand that it's not just what your experience is, it's about what you want. What matters most to patients and what is the relative importance of these different aspects of care, and what trade-offs might you be willing to take in order to have something. For example, will you drive 500 kilometers and will you pay $500 to have a certain valve replacement, perhaps, maybe if it's a device, or and so forth. So it's about really trying to establish what's important and what patient wants, and look at the value health states, and of course predict, what the uptake and acceptability of these health interventions and care might be. So this is what patient preferences are. So. I think it's most easily described by saying, it's what patients want. But in her wisdom, Deborah McDonald gave me, when we were doing our work, a definition that I like to use, and that is that patient preference information is qualitative or quantitative assessment of the relative desirability or acceptability of alternatives. So it's what a patient wants and values, and it's qualitative or quantitative data with analytical outputs. Now, we as patient groups we're not researchers necessarily in that regard, having experience with doing a quantitative research, but we know the experts, and that's what's more important. And that's what I learned as a lawyer, that it's not what you know, it's who you know and where to ask the questions and ask the right questions. And that's where we could help design those patient preference studies. We can help circulate them and get patients to participate in them, and leave it to the experts, to analyze the data. And I have to say, it always amazes me what the results are when that data is being analyzed. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, that makes me think, is there one study, because you've been involved in many, that really stands out in your mind in terms of what you found out and your contribution to it?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing wasn't designing the study in the first place. I thought it would be a great idea just to take all the best surveys, put them all together, and make one survey. And then I had to learn about validated assessment tools, EORTC questionnaires, EQ5DL, and so forth. So, from a patient group perspective, it's important to at least have a basic understanding of what the validated assessment tools were. And when we designed our study, which was on colorectal cancer, in Canada for the patients who had colon or rectal cancer, those who were metastatic patients, the another group who were caregivers, and then the public at large. We started to do the analysis at the end, and it was quite surprising what we found. For example, we thought that patients, and I assumed that you might think the same thing, that patients would prefer an oral therapy compared to an IV therapy. In this study, the patients thought that they preferred the IV. And maybe it was because it was during COVID. Maybe they wanted to socialize and have that security of seeing the doctors. We don't know. But it underscored the fact that patient preferences are fluid. So we didn't know at that time if we were dealing with what stage the patients were at. So they could be metastatic and they maybe had one line of treatment, or maybe they were on their fourth line of treatment, and different things and different preferences were important to them. So we found different things that were important to patients, such as that progression-free disease was important to all groups. They all thought it was equally important, but the public thought that the patients would like, as I said, that have an oral therapy rather than an IV. So it's a good example to see the dichotomy between the different groups and to compare. But what we learned in our patient preference subgroup as well is that these things are fluid. And the real question is, once we come and we have some of these answers, what do you do with it? And what are those relevant things to look at? Willingness to pay, predicted uptake, non-health benefits, maximum acceptable risk, endpoint prioritization, really serious questions about what should be considered when evaluating and determining whether or not to recommend the reimbursement of a drug. And I'll just, close off by saying that well, the methods person at Canada's Drug Agency, Farah Hussein, really, I think, summarized it for me. I wasn't too happy about this, but what she said is patient preferences we consider all the time, but not necessarily in the context of a patient preference study. And that what it does, it is adds context. So I was really feeling bad when she said it, it just adds context to what everybody has to say. And I want to figure out how do we give it equal weight to what the other inputs are? And that is an unresolved question for future work. And we state that in the chapter as well. So there are a lot of barriers. There's a lot of things to consider. But at the end of the day, I just say it's not that complicated. It's what patients want, and how do you make those people who are making recommendations understand that this is equally important to be considered as clinical benefit.
It's really useful. I'm thinking a little bit about Pascal's cat as I'm thinking about this, but I'm also thinking about a history which was full of people making assumptions about patient preferences, whether it was, as individuals when you visit a clinician, or whether it was policymakers and regulators around the trade-offs that patients would make. And I think what's really interesting about your example is that community so well, and yet research can show us things that can surprise us, and that shows how valuable it is. Now, everyone is very welcome to put questions in the box, but I notice you haven't. So perhaps like me, you're just enjoying listening to our speakers. I wanted to go back to something I was thinking about, because what I hear as we're talking here is I kind of feel like we're talking sometimes about translation of different languages, the patients to the non-patients in HTA, the qualitative to the quantitative researchers, the different disciplines and so forth. And that made me think, Pascal, if I could ask you a question, that you've taught qualitative research to graduate students for many years, and those aren't just people who are going down a qualitative path. Those are healthcare professionals, they're engineers, they're economists. And I was wondering, is there something you learnt in those years that can help illuminate the path we need to forge to help these areas come together?
Thank you. And I guess there are many things that others could contribute as well to the conversation. But by teaching this course for about 15 years, I've learned that it was important to create space for practical hands-on exercises that are likely to lead to transformative moments. You know, the type of ha-ha moments where you say, "Ha, I've just learned something." And these moments are where the concepts and the theory and the principles fall into place all of a sudden. And these transformative moments will change the way engineers, statisticians, and clinicians think about qualitative data. So and what I liked about the those teaching moments is that I do know that those things cannot be unlearned. You cannot forget about them once you've been transformed. So I guess that the what was harder was to be patient and take the time needed to debunk the preconception they arrive with in class. And those preconceptions, every discipline has a number of them, assumptions about. And those assumptions come from what they've read, what they've been told. So you have to bring them into a space that really hands on, and so they can experience what it is that we're trying to do. So I guess this is what you need to be patient and you need to create the space for transformative moments. Doesn't happen 100% of the time with 100% of the individuals, but when it does, it's something durable, I believe.
Oh, thank you, Pascal. Barry, can I come back to you because I was thinking about you as a patient author. I know you're more than a patient author. You have an extensive career in patient advocacy and in the legal system. But I was thinking about being, a patient author in a chapter like patient preferences. And next week we're going to have a session on patient authorship. But I was thinking about how you bridge the knowledge, whether you could give us some insights about how you bridge the knowledge you bring from a patient perspective when you're reflecting on a process like patient preferences to communicate to it. Is it sometimes I think when you've been doing it for a long time, it can be hard to disentangle the role. But are there any insights you can give us? Because we thought, if, for example, I just want to say in the first book, we had one chapter that had patient authors. And in this chapter, 3/4 did. And I felt you could feel that, but I couldn't articulate it well. Can you help us in that space? Because I think this being able to bridge disciplines with language is really critical.
One of the advantages that I have is that I was sort of participating in the development of what became the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, which is the HTA for oncology, before it became part of Canada's Drug Agency in its early days. And also at Ines when they started their template input. So seeing it develop and seeing how the patient sort of input was growing up in terms of importance, in terms of the consideration there, I had a little bit of that advantage to see what was going on. And when I started, when I was diagnosed, there was one drug, 5-FU, and now we have a buffet of drugs, right, to choose from at all different prices, which was something which was only a few dollars to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and diagnostic tests now that have to be considered and so forth. So really, there's been an explosion both in and I think this is why HTA is so important, why it's grown so much, is because there's been an explosion of treatments and diagnostics and access to profiling and so on and so forth. So it's really a great and exciting time to be involved because this is an opportunity where under the stresses of this existential threat that's happening from the US in terms of the most favored nation status, we will see an upward pressure on our countries, on our HTA countries, to increase the prices of drugs with a limited budget. So either we have less drugs for the same price, or we have, we increase the drug budget or increase the quality or whatever. So this is really an interesting thing because we are starting to see some sort of resistance, and particularly in Europe, to by countries. But drug companies are making their deals. So we won't see it for the next few years, perhaps, but we are going to start to see that impact very soon. And this is something where it's so, opportune to be able to provide something that could be considered of value, to those who have to consider making these recommendations. And so I'll just say that HTA and patient group underscore patient group input will help to demonstrate the value so that our health technology assessment bodies can better appreciate what's important and what patients want, in addition to the other factors that they have to consider.
Thanks,
I'm not
Barry. I
sure if
know
I
that.
answered your question.
Well,
Exactly.
actually, you said something very interesting, which I think will really resonate with a lot of the conversations we're having here in Australia at the moment. And I'm watching the time tick away. And as I said to our speakers when we were preparing for today, a sensible person would have organized 1 hour with each of them and still come away disappointed for all the things we didn't get to. But what I hope it's given you all is a taste of what's in that book and a taste of the knowledge that's out there, because we know not everyone's going to read the book, and we're realistic about that, but you can dive into it, and there's a huge amount of knowledge in this space. That the lack of methodology, the lack of in practice is not what's holding us back, and that was a key point around writing the book. So I'm just going to share some screens really quickly with you. Hopefully now you can see something with a big rainbow on it. And if you're looking at the diagram from chapter 33, and there's also the QR code there if you want to access the book. It's there for free. If you find yourself on a page that doesn't have a free book, you're probably in the 2017 version. So look for 2026. I'm not going to go through those 7 calls for action today in detail because they really resonate with some of the points we've talked about here. And some of that was investing in that qualitative research. Some of that, we talk about building skills and understanding in this area, and we're not talking about more training for patient organizations. We see great stuff going on equipping patients and their organizations. We see less stuff for HTA bodies and industry in building these skills. So we're really focusing there. We're talking about evaluation. So familiar themes that we touched on there today. I'm just going to flick to my next slide if I can. I want to thank now our sponsors, our gold and silver sponsors who help Patient Voice Initiative do all the things that we do. We're greatly appreciative to all of you. Before I pop off there, actually, why not? I want to promote next week's webinar. We're actually going to be picking up on some of the things we talked about, Roma. Your epistemic injustice is definitely going to be coming back to be a point for discussion next week. And I know that our speakers have actually asked for this recording. Some of them are in the UK and they can't join us today because they want to catch up on this. So we're going to be hearing from 3 experts around patient authorship next week, and you can register there. And also you can check out our tools. If we were saying HTA, you have no idea what we're talking about, that's a very healthy response. And you can find out more following that QR code or contacting us for more. And with that, I want to thank our incredible panelists. It's been such a pleasure for me. Alicia Segrave, Barry Stein, Roma Dhamanaskar, Pascal Liu, and thank you also to Cecily in the background, who's there always making everything work smoothly. We're really appreciative. You will have also seen our president, Sarah McGorham, joining us today online. Thank you for all of your attendance. I'm sorry the hour went so quickly, but I hope that it was really useful for you, and we look forward to seeing you next week if you're able to join us. Thanks for now.